I'm the Director of the Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands, in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and also of the Donder Center for Cognitive Neuroimaging. I'm not a linguist by training, but a psychologist and a biologist. And what I'm especially interested in is how this unique human capacity for communication, namely by means of language, is supported by the infrastructure of the human brain. Because of course, although other species also have communication systems, they don't have the complexity and the characteristics that human language has. So in one form or another, the human brain must be equipped with infrastructure that allows us to have this unique human capacity. And of course, that capacity is like fundamental to the human condition, because without this, we could not communicate as we do now. We wouldn't have like accumulation of knowledge. We wouldn't be able to write books. We wouldn't be able to do all kind of complex joint action that requires communication with language and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's an important topic for understanding the human condition. And clearly that depends on the contributions of multiple fields, field of linguistics, to understand what is it that we talk about when we say language, because there are like 6,000 or so languages in the world. They vary quite a bit, but at the same time, they have certain commonalities which we need to understand. Of course, we, as a speaker and a listener, we have to implement this in psychological processes, such as speaking and listening, which is highly remarkable because we do this very fluently. I produce in the order of 3-4 syllables per second, and have to instruct in the order of 100 muscles to do this in a coordinated fashion. So it's one of the most complex motor tasks, for instance, that we perform. And likewise, we have to then do this in interactions, all kind of other people monitor this communication and the interaction that happens all the time. So and then, as I said before, this is supported by the infrastructure of the human brain. So these different fields have to collaborate and come together and see how jointly we can, in one form or another, understand the puzzle of how we communicate by language. That's what I do for a living.
And regarding your specific area of study of language, what do you think are the great milestones in the last years, in the last 2 decades or 3 decades?
Now, of course, there are multiple milestones. One thing I think is the fact that our understanding of what the language is, how we speak and listen, we can connect this much more strongly to also the infrastructure of the human brain, because of the fact that we now have all these modern tools of looking at the human brain in action, such as fMRI, MEG, and so on. And clearly in other domains like memory or visual perception, we have animal models because we can study animals and see how they do it in their brains. But for human language, there is not a very successful animal model available because, as I said before, this is a unique human capacity. So we are much more dependent on brain imaging tools that have become available in recent decades in order to study the connection between, on the one hand, the possibility to speak and listen and use language, on the other hand, how that's implemented in the brain. So that's one major development. Of course, the other milestone is that more in the domain of the increased computational possibilities, like machine learning, big corpora, language corpora that are available, and using measures from information science that came up after the Second World War by people like Shannon and so on, and measures like entropy and surprisal, that now we can harvest in huge data corpora, because now we have the possibility to collect all these texts and extract information values from these texts in the context of how word meanings are dependent on the company that words keep and so on and so forth. So that's another major milestone. And of course, a third major milestone is that a lot of work has been done also in the field of typology. As I said before, the world has still in the order of 6,000 or so languages around, but in the past, very many of these studies were based on only a few languages. Clearly, if we want to understand as a linguist the full human scale of linguistic capacities, we need to also study more than one or two languages. We need to study multiple languages in order to see what is the variation, what's the limits on variation, and so on. And this can only be done by carefully studying multiple languages and do the typological careful work that needs to be done. Also in your part of the world, of course, there are multiple interesting languages that one can study, and that should be added to the portfolio of linguistic insights that we have acquired.
Yes, and you mentioned that one of the great milestones are the modern tools for looking human brains. And I was wondering, what do you think? I mean, neuroimaging techniques have advanced considerably in the last years, but do you think the techniques we currently have allow us to respond to key questions about the functional and structural anatomy of languages, or do you think we have a limit there of the technology we have nowadays?
It's always the case that, of course, every method has possibilities, but also its own limitations. So I therefore, for instance, myself, in my own group, we use multiple techniques in order to compensate for the weaknesses of one technique by the possibilities of another technique. So for instance, if you take fMRI, we can quite precisely localize certain language functions in the brain, but it doesn't have the dynamics that actually our brain activity itself has. So in order to get like insights into the dynamics, you have to use methods that have a high temporal precision, like MEG or EEG, in order to get a better handle on how dynamic these processes in the brain happen. And then you have to try to combine these different insights in getting a fuller picture. But none of these individual techniques will solve the problem in and of itself. So you always have to try to get insights from different directions and different domains in order to see how we can put the different pieces of the puzzle together.
Yes, that's right. And related to this question, what do you think are the current challenges we're facing in the area?
Well, I mean, one of the challenges also, I think, for the field of linguistics as a whole, or at least a few challenges that I see is one is that, let's say, modern way of using language are, if I look, for instance, my own child, quite different than when I was young. So we were reading books and so on and so forth. These days, kids and many other people use language in much more multimodal settings. So they get their linguistic input not by just reading large bits of text, but looking at like YouTube and these kind of things and so on. So language, I think it's important for the field of linguistics to take the embeddedness of language in other domains of information into consideration more, because in one way or another, we are able to combine the information that comes from language with all kinds of other sources of information in building up a kind of situation model or interpretation of the input that we receive. And of course, historically, the field of linguistics has tried to focus mostly like as a single linguist. Most linguists focus on only one aspect of linguistics. For instance, you have people that work on syntax, you have people that work on phonology, there are linguists that work on semantics or morphology and so on. So these are all different branches of linguistics. But in the end of the day, these pieces have to be brought together as well, because let's say, of course, we as a real human language user, we combine all these different pieces of linguistic information, but at the same time, we also combine it with other types of information that we recruit from the world around us, the visual input that we get, some of the pragmatic context in which language happens, and so on and so forth. So studying the language in context, namely the non-linguistic context, but also the interface between the different levels of linguistic structure, is, I think, a major challenge for the coming decades in order to get a fuller picture of how the system is organized and works in real practice.
Well, yesterday we were actually talking with Cedric Boex, and he mentioned some thoughts on the same line, and he mentioned the importance of doing interdisciplinary work, but also of doing interdisciplinary work within linguistics. I mean, that's what you mentioned, right? The importance of also reading some other aspects of not only your subject of study, but
yes, no, I think I fully agree with him in that context. So first of all, as you're correctly inferred, that this has to happen between different levels within linguistics itself. So let's say people doing semantics should talk to people doing phonology and syntax. That's one thing. But at the same time, it's also important to, as a linguist, to talk to other fields of cognitive science. In fact, this the two periods in the post-Second World War history of linguistics when it was most successful was one just after the Second World War, when information science came up and where linguists played an important role with like information scientists and so on. And secondly, in the 70s, when the whole field of cognitive science came on board, where linguists and psychologists and computer scientists and also neuroscientists tried to see how collectively they could build up the field of cognitive science. For sociological reasons, the field of linguistics has a bit like isolated itself from these other domains. And I think it's crucial also, it's crucial for not only these other domains, but also for the progress of the field of linguistics itself, to reconnect to these other domains and these other fields. Because I think in the end of the day, linguistics is one part of a bigger puzzle, namely how to understand the organization of the human mind. In the end of the day, we want to understand how is the human mind operating, working, and what is the consequence of the fact that the human species has language at its disposal, not only for how we then can communicate, but also what is the consequence, for instance, of having language for other domains of like perception, memory, and so on and so forth, because that's an often ignored part of the field. I sometimes call this the enlanguagement of the brain. So the fact that we have language is not only in of itself interesting, but also has consequences for other central cognitive functions, such as action, memory, perception, and so on. And that we are doing actually research on this domain. So let's say if you have a categorical verbal label and you give some visual input, you can find that this has a consequence for how you perceive that particular visual input, and that's due to the fact that language puts a kind of like gives a cue on what to focus on in the input that you might receive through other sensory channels, and this might therefore influence also these other domains, and that's something which is purely dependent on the organization of the language system itself.
Yes, that's right. And you also mentioned that some moments in history where linguists were like, there was like more importance of the area. So related to that, no, what do you think are the contributions of a linguist to society? And why do you think sometimes like the work we do is undermined? Because I mean, I feel that people think that linguists only do prescriptive work, like we only do dictionaries and we only do that kind of work. So what do you think are the other contributions of a linguist to society?
Well, I mean, I think there are multiple contributions of a linguist to society. First of all, of course, it can vary a bit from country to country. So I'm not well enough aware of the situation in Argentina, how linguists are being perceived in Argentina. But certainly, I think it's important to make the broader audience aware of the richness and complexities of language and its multiple forms. So, for instance, for a long time, it has been thought by the general audience that sign language, the language of the deaf, is a kind of impoverished sort of language. Now, based on linguistic analysis of sign language, we now know that it's as rich as any other language. So to make people aware of the fact that the diversity there is between languages, that the richness it has, at the same time also the fact that it's still all based on some common linguistic underlying basis, I think is an important contribution. Also, I think it's important to see how you can contribute to well, teaching, not necessarily in the sense of that prescriptive to say, well, this is the rule you have to follow, otherwise you get hit on your head. But in one way or another, of course, there are cases where children suffer from because they have specific language impairment or dyslexia or these kind of cases. And it's important to have sufficient knowledge about the different complexities of and aspects of language in order to be helpful to see what kind of treatment can be done. So that's another and at the same time, of course, it's the case that there are multiple levels in which communication can be helped by the way we use language. So, for instance, I just wrote a kind of proposal the other day called Words as Medicine, where I gave the following example. So, for instance, a doctor can say to the patient, with this treatment, you have 10% chance of dying, or you can say you have 90% chance of surviving. This is exactly the same message, but of course, the way it's being phrased and the way it's being packaged has substantial consequences of how the patient will appreciate and receive that message. And that has to do with the fact that, like, all kind of pragmatic and information structure packaging of information in language, and of course, insight into the linguistic tools that you have available and the different ways in which you can apply that. That is something where linguistics can also help very much. So, for instance, we did a study here also in involvement of the so-called theory of mind network in pragmatic language processing. For instance, when I asked someone else, did you like my presentation? One possible answer is, no, I didn't like it at all. It was very bad. Another possibility is to say, it's hard to give a good presentation. Again, it is a polite form of saying the same. But, and we see that in order to appreciate these more indirect conversational implicatures, you need to recruit your theory of mind network. So that's, for instance, where patients with autistic spectrum disorder often fail. They fail to appreciate the conversational implicatures that are packaged into your linguistic expression, for which you not only need your core language areas in the brain that allow you to recognize words and parse a sentence in the correct way, but also the theory of mind network that gets you from coded meaning in the expression to the speaker meaning, namely the meaning that the speaker wants to convey by his or her expression. So all these kind of different things, all the levels of complexities linguists are aware of, not always the broader audience is aware of, and that can also be helpful and used by, for instance, when government or other institutions want to convey certain messages and so on and so forth. The way it's being packaged is crucial, and that's all dependent on insight into different levels of the linguistic organization.
Yes, that's true. And do we have time for one or two more questions?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. Great. So, what topics do you think should be paid more attention in the following years regarding the study of language? Or what topics do you think should be investigated in the next years?
Well, I mean, I think I already kind of, the challenges that I saw, of course, also are in some way pointing to where I believe things should go. Namely, let's say, a language in context, that is the different levels of linguistics, how they are interfaced to each other. So this is, for instance, what Ray Jackanoff calls the interface systems, the interface between the different levels. Now, often linguistic theories have their own specifics for every level of analysis. So you have like a minimalist program for syntax, an optimality theory for phonology, and so on. But it's not clear whether that theoretical framework can cover not only one level, but also the other level. So there is a more integrated view is necessary. And the other thing is, as I said before, also the language in context aspect. So how is language embedded in other cognitive systems? It's not isolated in of itself. It operates in close harmony and close connection to other systems. And I think it's also important to study that embeddedness more strongly than is being done currently, or at least has been done until now. So these are kind of things that I hope linguists like yourselves would be able to study. And I also think it's important for your careers to reach out to other domains of cognitive science. Not only talk to linguists, but also talk to other fields of cognitive science, people from other experimental psychology, computer science, neuroscience, and so on and so forth. Because I think in the end of the day, linguists has a lot to offer to these domains, especially thinking about what are the representational structures that we compute. So, for instance, a visual neuroscientist often don't think much about what the representation structures are. They claim, if I present a face to you, then there is a fusiform face area that recognize faces, but whether or not the representational structure that's computed by the neurons in that particular face area is really like a little bit of an image of a face, or whether it's a more abstract representational structure, is not topicalized in these fields much. And of course, in linguistics, we realize that this is not the way how it can work in language. So we think about what are the representation structures for syntax, for morphology, for phonology, and that's something linguists have on offer also to these other domains of cognition, where you can make people a little bit less naive in terms of the representational structures that need to be also computed in other domains of cognition. And of course, there are lots of similarities you can also see in terms of music, mathematics, and all kind of other domains that in one way or another have a certain similarity to the like recursiveness of language and other aspects of language that might have co-evolved in order to get also these functionalities off the ground, and where linguistic insights might help you also to understand those particular faculties.
Yes, and you mentioned several sciences between regarding neuroscience and psychology and so on. But I was also thinking about philosophy, right? Because
yes,
also philosophy makes us think what you mentioned.
You're fully correct. That's certainly another important branch of conceptual knowledge that need to be taken on board.
And maybe one last question is, what advice would you give to a young linguist who is starting out on linguistic research?
What kind of advice I have? Well, I think my two things that I would like to, as a general advice. One thing which is not specific to linguistics, but which I always find useful also in other domains. Try to find a niche for yourself that's not already occupied by 5,000 other people, because then what happens is you're one fish in a large pond of many other fishes. At the same time, of course, also it doesn't help if you do something which no one else is working on, because then you're the only fish in the pond. So find find a niche where you still feel you can make a contribution, where it's not already overpopulated, but do something where you feel, okay, there is still enough stuff to figure out, because it's and it's not only a minor contribution that I can make. That's the one thing. The other thing is kind of what I already indicated before. Try to reach out to other adjacent fields and try to both get input from and insights from these other fields, but also try to see how you can contribute and collaborate and interact with these other fields. Because the general tendency in all of science is more and more team science. More and more we realize that a single contribution, a single person cannot solve the big puzzles. We need to collaborate and entertain in team efforts in order to see how big questions can be addressed by bringing together people with different expertise and different backgrounds and jointly try to answer the big questions that are part also of our field.
Yes, I think that's a huge advance, because I think that academia needs to learn how to work in team, and not only us as researchers, but also the system that is evaluating us. So
right, yes. And here we, in the Netherlands, I'm also in connection to the granting agencies. I try also to, and that is changing. They now also, for instance, give prizes to teams rather than only to individuals, and so on and so forth. I did an analysis for myself at some point of papers in Nature and Science, not from 1930 onwards to recent, to 2015. And not in terms of topics and so on, but just how many authors are there on any given paper. And then what you see is that in 1940 until like 1990 or something, like in this period, it's mostly 1 or 2 authors. Now it's on average, or 9 authors on any paper in Science and Nature, which is already an indication of the fact that it is already, we are already in the era of team science. All major discoveries are made by large or larger teams of people. It's no longer the individual. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. Clearly, it's not. There are always exceptions. And if you take the major discoveries of the recent times, like the gravitational wave discovery, had a paper with 1,000 authors on it. And likewise in the multiple papers on genetics. Actually, I am on genetics paper with 200 other authors. So that means that this is already happening at a large scale, and clearly indicating that, of course, let's say you could say the easy problems have already been solved by science in the past. The more harder the problems get, the more complex the questions and so on, the harder it gets for a single individual to make a decisive contribution. So in that sense, we are much more going to be much more dependent on also team science, and moreover, we have an increased number of complex tools like technological. I mean, I can't do my my very advanced imaging, MRI imaging, without an MR physicist, because the MR physics is highly complicated and so on. Of course, and in the past these tools were not available, so you could, like, you might have had a telescope or some binoculars, but that was it if you wanted to look at like outer space. Nowadays there are all these other incredibly complex physics tools, and these also in our field, and that means no single person can claim that he or she understands all of this, and you need really to collaborate in order to jointly solve the puzzles.
yes, here in our country, it's not so accepted yet as not, I mean, as individuals, because there are huge team groups, but when we get evaluated by the CONICET, that is the huge scientific organization here. For example, if you have a paper of 10 authors, only one point gets the first author, and then that varies. So we still have to learn how to work as teams in all the aspects.
Yeah, and certainly in the humanities, it's still a little less common than in some of the more harder sciences. So in that sense, still some miles to go, but in the end, we'll get there at some point.
Yes, I hope to. And I don't know if my teammates want to add something else, or if you would like to ask us anything.
Well, of course, I'm very much interested in what your conference is about and how the situation for your field is in Argentina, because I mean, I've never visited Argentina, but of course I'm very much interested to understand how you see your own field moving forward in your country.
Well, our conference is a conference for young researchers. We are thinking of grad students and PhD students.
Right.
And we actually discussed how is the field in our country when we were preparing these interviews. And we said that there's a lot of work on typology and indigenous languages. And there's also a lot of work or some new work regarding psycholinguistics, and also a lot of work regarding analysis of discourse and theoretical linguistics regarding like syntax and so on.
Right.
But yes, there's we think there's a lot of work on linguists in our country, but for example, there's some work we are not able to do because there's no fMRI or MEG for us to use like freely, because there are some in the country, but maybe they are used mostly by physics or biologists. So, or the same goes with the eye tracker, right? There are like few eye trackers in the country, and they are used by 2 or 3 teams with private funding. So maybe that sometimes that's kind of tough, but I think, yes, we are like a prominent country in the study of linguists. I don't know if you want to add something else, Brenda or Laura.
Oh, sorry. So what are the job opportunities once you're finished your study? What are the job opportunities for you?
Well, that's a tough question. The job opportunities, I would say, like they are close to 0.
Really?
Not that dramatic, not that tragic, but more or less. We can work, of course, as teachers at different universities. But if we want to work on research in linguistics, it's really hard. We can only work, I think we can only work for the CONICET, that is the scientific council of, the scientific council of the country, that is a public institution. And for example, every year, I have a scholarship at the CONICET because I'm doing my PhD. And every year, the CONICET opens the possibility to new researchers to enter, but as a permanent job. And for example, last year, only 1 linguist entered. So it's actually really hard.
Yeah. Okay. So who else did you, Cedric Brooks, you interviewed? So are there other people that you kind of have on the list?
Yes, we have already talked with several linguists. We have already talked with Jakendorf, Eichenwald, Van Dijk, sorry. I don't know, no other names are coming to me.
Menguenot, Dominique Menguenot, de análisis del discurso. ¿Quién más?
De Hirsch Pasek.
Hirsch Pasek.
Charles Basserman.
Michael Tomasello. Yes, Michael Tomasello.
And
yes.
And you're all going to show these things during your conference, or what's the idea?
Yes, we have like two separate ideas. First, we thought that nobody would answer our mails, so we are really glad of having these interviews.
Yeah.
So we have the first idea of showing like little pieces of each interview during the conference, and then releasing the whole interviews afterwards, and uploading them to YouTube. That's okay with you?
Sure.
So we will have a first short and edited version, and then the long and complete version.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Well, okay. Thank you very much for your
Okay,
time.
thank you.
Or
And
your
I wish you a lot of luck with your meeting and also your personal careers. I hope you all find a decent follow-up of what you're doing now. And of course, I don't know about the COVID-19 situation in Argentina at the moment, but hopefully that will also get better at some point, so that we can really meet in real life rather than only via Zoom.
Yes, and if in the post-COVID world, if there will be any, you're more than invited to come to Argentina and give a course, give a conference. We were really happy to receive you.
I would love to, but hopefully that will work at some point.
Well, okay, thank you very much for your time. It was really a pleasure.
Okay, all right.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
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 Bye.